Mike.
I'm Brad.
And this is Ministry Chemistry.
Neutron, proton, mass effect, lyrical oxidation, your irrelevant mass spectrograph, your electron volt, atomic energy erupting as I get all open on pow.
Here we go.
Welcome back to another episode of Ministry Chemistry, where today, literally this conversation, this is how this rolled out. I'm just going to put it out there. We all went to lunch. It was delicious. Yes.
It was good.
It was.
And we started this conversation, and I was just like, this is the episode. This is what we need to do. Mike's a little worried that we're beyond the actual event. We're a little past it. And I said, no, this is still going to be relevant. So here's the event. You decide for yourself whether you want to listen for the next 25 minutes. A few weeks ago, horrible fire hit the Notre Dame Cathedral. And there's now a big campaign to raise money to fix what was broken and fix what has been damaged. And there's a big controversy surrounding that because it's millions and hundreds of millions of dollars. And there's question marks.
Yeah, I think the last I'd heard 600 million, I think, was raised.
How should that be what that money goes towards? And so today we're going to have a conversation to try to figure out how we feel about that question and those answers. And this is on the heels of, if you listened last week, we talked about creating environments and creating spaces where maybe people can meet Jesus. And so fresh off the heels of that, first off, just big question. This is going to affect, the first thing I thought was, anyone who visits Paris in the next year, at least.
I'd say more.
More. 5 years?
Or more.
This will affect their sightseeing. That was my first thought. It wasn't, this will affect a body of worshipers. Is that shame on me, or is there truth to that?
Yeah. I mean, I found out, I hope this is true. I hope I'm not broadcasting this, but that the government of Paris or France owns the building.
Yes.
Is that
that's
correct?
True. That's true.
Oh, so it's not even the Roman Catholic Church?
No.
It's facilitated and run by the church, but the government owns the structure.
Correct.
Huh.
So
So this is a governmental problem that they have to fix.
yes, yes, and that's sort of kind of like the conservative libertarian side of the argument is if private funds aren't raised to rebuild it, then it will fall to the taxpayer because it's a government building.
Wow. I didn't know
Which
that.
is interesting, you know.
So then my first thought of this will affect many sightseers adds up. Like
Yeah,
that's
I
okay to
would-
say.
Yeah.
Versus,
Yeah, I'd say that's accurate.
you know, like if my church building burns down, it affects a body of people. It does not affect taxpayers. It does not affect.
Nobody's driving to see this place.
Well,
not where I go to
if
church, no.
I haven't. Before I say this, I haven't. So don't. Have you? Either you been to Paris?
No, my sister has, and she's seen it, and yeah.
Have you?
I have not. My wife has. but
Okay.
I-
Because I was gonna say, I mean, even having not been to Paris, it's probably Eiffel Tower, then Notre Dame,
Yeah.
then the Louvre, probably
Probably.
on that
They're-
top
they're
three,
top three. Yeah.
sightseeing destinations. And it's not just Christians going to see
No.
Notre Dame.
And it is a gorgeous structure. I mean,
Oh yeah, it's beautiful.
was.
It was.
It still
is that
is.
what you said? Did you say
It still is.
it was? Is that too soon?
Yeah, it's probably too
So
soon.
$600
That's okay,
million.
that's-
I know what it costs to build a building here in the United States, like a community center. You know, we've all been a part of construction projects and churches, and it don't cost no $600 million.
But I knew you were gonna say
that's not what that costs.
it's not just the structure; it's the elaborate nature of the structure. It's like the difference between putting up, like 3-inch baseboard versus crown molding. You know what I mean? You're basically building the same thing. It's just the elaborate nature makes it like
Not only that,
much
but
more expensive.
you have the historical ramifications of it.
Yeah.
I mean, when I was on a mission trip to London, there was a church that we were supposed to be working on. We couldn't even get into the church because there was a disagreement between the project manager and the community leader, and so many things have to run through red tape to get approved, to get built. Even apartment buildings have to go through so much bureaucracy. So I think something of Notre Dame, that level, would have to go through even more so.
Sure.
So there's more to slow things down. There's more to pay for. So
Well, and so there's a great argument on the table, and I understand it, that it's a sacred space. It's a holy space. It is a house of God, right? It hasn't been for me.
No.
And so I'm not saying I don't care. Like the listeners are like, oh my gosh, Renee's heartless. That's not what I'm saying. But there are other places, if they got destroyed, I'd be much more heartbroken over than this place, because this place hasn't had much significance for me. How selfish am I? But that's the reality of it. Like, I'm curious, where would you guys say are sacred spaces for you that just have meaning? Not that if they got destroyed, you'd be heartbroken, but like, wow, that was a really significant space for me.
Well, there are different levels. I mean, my church growing up would be one where I was introduced to Jesus. That would be one. I've had quote unquote experiences in other places. The first time that my wife and I went to Washington D.C., we went to National Cathedral, and as we walked through the door, choir practice was going on. So it was like, the gates of heaven are thrown open, and the angels are singing. It's like, this is amazing.
Yeah.
Just goosebumps just thinking about the space as you walk in. I've been to St. Paul's Cathedral in London. I mean, it's just awe-inspiring because of the history of it, the
magnitude, right?
Magnitude. It's
the bigness.
You can't wrap your head around how large it is.
Yeah.
But then there's...
Which equates to the investment of people and investment
absolutely.
of generations and the, yeah.
But then more personally, I mean, just... There are places that I've gone hiking that are sacred to me. I mean, just times when I've heard little nuggets from God that of what I should be doing, where I should be going, those kinds of things. It doesn't have to necessarily be a building.
So I said something a little snarky. I said, can you believe it?
The shocked look on my face.
I know. I said, yeah, because Jesus said we'll take Notre Dame with us when we go, so we should probably pour that money in. How did you feel about that I said that like that?
Oh, I'm used to it.
Oh,
it doesn't
okay.
bother me.
No, but like, what do you think of the investment of these resources into this space?
Part of me
Used to it.
Part of me looks at the temple was one of the most elaborate church structures ever. And you read about the temple in the Old Testament, and I mean, even the tent of meeting that traveled was very elaborate.
Folks, if you haven't looked into
very detailed.
The details that God said, this is how it will be built, and this is, I mean, down to the threads and the yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things that struck me about it, and I think I read this last year, read through Hebrews mentions it and Exodus mentions the same thing. It basically talks about to this pattern and scale. And it's almost as if God is saying, here's your replica of heaven to travel around with you.
Huh. And
it's just interesting the verbiage that it uses to describe the tent of meeting and eventually the temple. But God was very, very specific. Now, I'm not saying Notre Dame is the temple of Israel. And obviously the temple was destroyed. And, as Christians, we believe Jesus is the temple now, but I do think there's something to it. I've never been to Notre Dame. My wife and I went to the Vatican, and standing in that sanctuary and Pieta, the Michelangelo statue where Mary is holding the crucified Christ. There's something powerful about that, and Michelangelo was a commissioned artist. I don't know what he was paid to make that statue, but I'm sure some investment went into that,
right?
So
and it has stood the test of time, and there's a reverence to those spaces too.
Yeah, and the whole ideal of that, most of that was like the Renaissance period, right, where these structures were built, and they were the whole intent, regardless of what it is now or what it has become, but the intent of churches like Notre Dame were to point people to God, just from the elaborate nature of the structure itself, you know. So there's like this visible representation of heaven on earth.
Yeah.
And there's something really cool and powerful about that, you know? So I try not to downplay that too much.
Yeah, and I don't want to dismiss it. I think for me, I live in this tension of a couple things. You said it's a visible representation of God on earth. Well, the church body is the visible representation of God on earth. There are church buildings, and then there are the people that are the church. So that's one thing that maybe I don't think it's semantics. I think it's important to distinguish the difference. But the other thing is, I went to Israel a couple years ago, and one of the things that really bothered me was on all these holy sites where Jesus was said to have give the story. People have built a church, a building, and they've built the building in part to protect the space, because once there was an opportunity to get the land, they wanted the land to be able to say, this is where he preached the Sermon on the Mount, and this is the space where he laid on this rock and he prayed, and I get it. And they're trying to protect what was understood to be the spaces. But for me, it was really hard, because it's like, I don't want to see the church building. I want to see the topography that Jesus would have seen. I want to see the hills and the land, and like try to envision the people being here. But now what I can envision is only this patio or this amphitheater, or in the church where the monuments, the Sermon on the Mount, there's been, I think, 2 popes that have visited maybe, and they've taken the robes that the Pope has worn upon his visit, and they framed those. And so when you're in this space, and there are people, and this isn't, they were taking pictures of them, and they were really moved by this, and so I don't want to dismiss that, but I struggled with it, because I'm like, Jesus said literally, these things will be eaten up by moths, and we have framed them on the place where he talked about, the most important things. And I just wonder if the falling of a monument such as Notre Dame is gotta be okay.
Space.
I know,
Yeah.
it's a space.
Yeah, there is space. Oh wow, that's deep.
It is. Well, and I don't want to fix Notre Dame. That's fine. Like, I'm not going to sit here and mount a crusade against it. But also, what could you do with $600 million? And do we get to judge it? Which goes back on our previous conversation about intent of the heart.
Yeah.
A private investor can put that into lumber for people to take pictures.
It would be interesting to see what percentage of those heavy donors and investors are not necessarily believers in the fullest sense that we consider it.
Well, then,
Because
then we could, if they are, how many of those donors are tithers? I would like to be.
well, I'm
That would be
thinking
interesting.
if they're not believers, then the believers, Christians in name only. Let's say that.
Yeah.
I mean, they're essentially investing back into the church.
Are they?
If we consider that structure as some kind of visible representation, then in a
Yes.
sense, yes.
Okay.
And there,
It depends on how much weight you put on that as a
there's
visible
still a
representation.
congregation that meets there.
Yeah.
Yes.
So-
So I had a friend who was her and her husband were supposed to worship there on Easter this year. And
Wow.
they couldn't,
Yeah.
clearly.
Wow.
But that was a big, she was disappointed for a variety of reasons,
of course.
not selfishly. But when she said that, I was like, oh my gosh. Yeah. Because there are still people that worship Jesus there, and that's important. But I want to hit on what Brad said earlier about not to harp on just tangible structures and buildings, but you said something about you've been on hikes and you've been in other spaces, and you talked about at lunch this idea of thin spaces. Can you share what that is, what that means?
There are times when you, whether it be on a hike or not, one of the most reverent places that I've been is out in Washington State at Mount Rainier. We
Did you eat
went
cherries?
We did not.
Okay, sorry.
We went out for my 40th birthday. We went out for a week because I had never been to Seattle, wanted to, and so my birthday's in October, which is the wettest month of the year in Seattle. It didn't rain until the last day we left, but
Man, you and weather in places
Yeah, right.
like San Diego,
was thinking that.
Seattle.
yeah, it's either really good or really bad.
Guys, don't go on vacation with Brad, or do.
Well, I have plenty of stories, but we're not going to share those right now.
Go where and when the weather's supposed to be bad.
Yeah.
And it'll be good.
Take
Yeah,
that.
there you go. But the day we went to Rainier, it was so crystal clear. The sky was so blue, and just spending that time in God's creation was an amazing thing. And Thin Spaces is the way, and I can't remember. It might have been the Celtic Christians way back when, but when your place of worship, whether if that's individually or corporately, when you have such a connection with God, such a sense of worship, that the space between earth and heaven becomes so close that they term it a thin place.
A thin place.
Where that the separation between the two is so minute that you can almost sense heaven.
That's beautiful.
So there are a lot of different times when I'm sure that we each have had experiences like that, and they weren't, no offense, Notre Dame,
Right.
but it was no less worshipful, no less that closeness wasn't felt. So.
Yeah, a friend. So you know the ceilings in certain buildings, how they're those tiles that on our grid, and you can just pop up the tile and whatever. Because of the spaces where he has worshipped, he says, he looks up and he sees those tiled ceilings, and he's like, sometimes that's my image of God, is that tiled ceiling, because I'm, lifting my hands in praise. And of course it's not, right? But he's like, that's how,
That's the only thing keeping us from heaven.
that's his thin space, but that's how nominal sometimes these structures get. Because
Take
it doesn't
out the
matter.
tiles.
Get closer, get that much closer. Well, and we touched on this a couple episodes ago about what do people worship when Jesus isn't centric? What are they actually worshiping? So for instance, I had a student in my youth ministry, and his goal, him and his dad, were trying to hit every major league stadium in their lifetime. They want to go see a baseball game in every major league
Love
stadium.
that goal.
Isn't that a great goal? Get a
Love
picture in front of each one. And it's beautiful.
$600 million. No, go ahead.
At the same
You
time,
could do it in one season for that.
it raises the question, what are you worshiping?
Yep.
And the same when we go to see like national landmarks and monuments. Like, we'd be devastated if, the Lincoln Memorial or
The Grand Canyon filled up.
the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon is a little different than a man-made structure, right? And was the Grand Canyon formed 6,000 years ago or 6 million years ago?
I don't know. Let's ask the
I've-
dinosaurs.
I've developed a little bit different view about our monuments specifically. I used to I love Washington D.C. But I used to walk around like, man, we are so arrogant. We love building monuments to ourselves, but there's a little bit of a biblical aspect to that. We build monuments not to worship, but so that we don't forget from where we came. We see in Europe right now this major rise in anti-Semitism because of a forgotten past.
And it's
So
scary.
it's given me a different. So structures like Notre Dame are a visible representation of that as well, about the past and the roots of the church and people that literally invested their whole life to death besides Christ. But I mean, there's more to it than just this. Okay, this structure points to God. That was some of the intent in building it in the first place. But now it is a monument. It's still a place of worship, but it's still a monument to the past as well.
Well, I think there's this, and I'm going to get into some controversial topics here because I've recently read Andy Stanley's Irresistible. And a big, statement in that book is this not living in an Old Testament life, but living in a fully Jesus New Testament life, unhitching ourselves from the Old Testament. And it's caused a lot of controversy, right? But I think about it in this context, and could the church be different in this event to say, hey, it's not about that building. Like, we're still going to worship. We're still going to gather. There's still sacred spaces. God is not bound to a building. Whereas in the Old Testament, he was bound. This is where he is. And there are still people today that at the Wailing Walls, they are there and they want to just draw close to God because that's where he is dwelling. And he isn't everywhere. So how does the church look different than just a rebuild of a monument? Is there an opportunity here, I guess is my question.
I mean, there's always an opportunity. There's an opportunity in rebuilding it just as much as there is in not.
What is that opportunity?
That the church continues on regardless of devastation.
Yeah. I could see that.
There's a piece of that.
Do you think there are worshipers of Notre Dame instead of worshipers of God, the God of Notre Dame?
Absolutely.
You think so? Like worshipers.
Like diehards for Notre Dame. Right? Like when Yankee Stadium was getting torn down and they were building the new one. I'm sure there were people out there just like really upset about that. If Wrigley went away, oh my gosh.
Don't touch it.
Right. Brad's a huge Cubbies fan.
You
If
can
Wrigley
take
went
note.
away, what would happen?
Wow.
But no, seriously, if
Here it is.
if they made the decision to tear it down,
Wrigley.
no, Notre Dame,
Oh, Notre Dame.
I would pray for their souls for Wrigley.
No.
But if they made the decision to tear down Notre Dame, I guarantee there would be people, not God worshipers, that would be in utter uproar
Yeah.
because of the building,
Yeah.
not because of God.
Absolutely.
It's funny because, like, when you say, "Oh, people worship it," like I don't think of it that way. But is it what you're describing as a sacred cow? Is it a sacred cow?
It is a sacred cow.
absolutely, absolutely. I mean,
A sacred
other than
cow. Yes, I knew it. This is so great.
other than just the sheer volume of people who know Notre Dame, is it any more a sacred cow than the space we're sitting in right now?
Literally, like this table and
we're
chairs.
in it. We're recording in a church building. You know what I'm saying?
I do.
You know what I'm getting at?
The church I
Like
grew
what
up in.
what percentage? And I'm not picking on your church.
No,
My church is same thing. I mean, we literally had people in an uproar because we were going to tear up a tile floor.
Right.
You know what I mean?
The
Like,
church I grew up in had a terrible fire hit in like the 70s. And I mean, the rebuild's beautiful, but you hear people, you know, the ones who are still there talk about this devastating situation that happened and we need to rebuild our church. But in the same vein, a friend of mine, they had a tree struck by lightning, and so they had to get rid of the tree. And like, it affected them in a way they didn't anticipate because they're like, our landscape has changed, right? And not that the tree meant anything, but it was a shift in something that was unexpected, and it changed the picture.
that's the key word.
yeah.
Change.
Yeah, it changed the
It is.
picture.
Do not do that.
Even those of us who are perfectly okay with change, that is still a dirty word in some aspects.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's something we'll have to get used to anew.
Yeah.
And a world, I mean, this sounds dramatic, but to some, I think it's a world without Notre Dame. But it's not, right? Because we're going to make sure that doesn't happen. What does that mean in our hearts? And, you know, the bigger question that you got to ask is, what does that mean eternally? Does it matter? Does it matter if the guy or the girl that's given the $600 million or the whatever they gave to that, if they do tithe or if they don't tithe or they give to charitable foundations or whatever, you know, we're asking something of them that we said we don't have to do a couple weeks ago, which is qualify your money.
Yeah.
Well, it's their money. They can give it to whoever they want.
Well, I was gonna say, like, we're qualifying the heart too.
Right. And I don't want to do that.
So, like, I mean, who are we to say that God didn't inspire them to give to the rebuilding of Notre Dame?
Did you guys see Black Panther?
Yes.
Brad, did you see Black Panther? Oh, Brad.
I have not.
It's so good,
I'm
and it's
sure
on
it
Netflix.
is. I hear it's really.
It's pretty good.
Okay, who's Killmonger, right?
Sure.
The other guy that goes up against Black Panther and tries to get.
Yes.
Okay, doesn't this make you understand his stance though? When he's like, Wakanda has all these resources, and
Yeah.
they didn't.
he's a capitalist.
Killmonger is a capitalist.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's your response to like, Wakanda has all these resources and they're not sharing it.
Right.
Wouldn't that? Okay.
He's talking about investing it.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. Capitalizing on the resources that they have,
Okay.
aka capitalists.
Okay. So someone. Okay. Now it's going in a different direction. I didn't want it to go in that direction.
You asked.
I know I asked,
You
but I
just
didn't think that
asked.
was going to be your answer. I was going to go like, if I don't have a right to ask them how they're spending their money, does somebody in the world? Does a hungry child? That's the direction I was going. Like, far more like eye rolling than capitalism, but good work there.
See, the reality is when you go down this road, it's just in our face as far as, oh, well, all this money is being raised. Why is it not being spent here? We could say that about a million things that
Yeah.
More
happen
than-
every single day.
I know.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
Why isn't this money being spent on, why isn't A funds being spent on B cause?
And it's not my money. Like,
Whatever.
clearly I was not given that money to
Yeah.
steward, so I don't get to decide what happens to it. I can have an opinion about it all day, but can't do a lick about it.
Right.
So has this been a fruitful conversation or not? Like, we haven't changed anyone's mind.
No, and we didn't go into it thinking that we were going to.
No.
You know.
But I think the questions are good to ask because if you bring it back to your own homes and your own families, there is a question of where are the sacred spaces and the places that are thin in your life where you feel the closest to heaven. I think there's a question of if the church building around you crumbled, would you still have the church as the body that matters?
I think we've seen that a little bit in the southern churches that have been burned.
Yeah.
They're still meeting. They still have found a place to meet, and they are still the church.
Right,
Now,
that's right.
some of them are being rebuilt. That's awesome. But
Yeah.
the building themselves are being rebuilt, but the church remains, and we've seen them rise up out of those situations.
And when they're not acts of terrorism, when they're natural disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes, tornadoes rising up and through, and the people still count and still matter, still worship.
one of
That's
the problems I have with the argument of, well, if that money were placed here instead of there, it would fix this. When has money, throwing
fixed
money at
anything.
something, fixed anything?
Good point.
People are like, oh, well, you could solve world hunger and poverty with $600 million. No, you couldn't.
Right.
No, you couldn't, because there are structures and there are mindsets that are still in place.
That's right.
And you might solve world hunger for a day or a week or a month, but eventually it's going to come right back around again because it's not a money problem ultimately.
So the funnest question we're going to leave you with today is, if you had $600 million, what would you do? Would you fix Notre Dame? Would you build a monument to yourself? Would you fill the Grand Canyon with jelly beans?
I think it would take more than $600 million.
I feel like, yeah.
To fill it with jelly beans?
Yeah.
I
What
feel
kind
like
of
it
jelly
would.
beans are you eating?
The good ones.
Sour Patch Kids jelly beans.
Yeah,
are pretty
Starburst.
awesome.
On that note, my name's Renee.
Still Mike.
And Brad.
We'll see you next time on Ministry Chemistry.